Maya Brooks becomes Skylink Air's first black female captain, but on her first day, she's made to feel like she's out of place. She spots warning signs, ignored malfunctions, fake reports, and pressure on mechanics to speed up maintenance. When she uncovers the truth, she realizes there's more at stake than just her career, the lives of thousands of passengers. But can she break the system with the entire airline giant against her? Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss news stories. The sun was just beginning to break through the thick morning fog that blanketed the runways of O'Hare International Airport. The air was thick with the smell of jet fuel, coffee, and the anticipation of a new day. Maya Brooks strode confidently through the terminal, heading to the Skylink Air building, where her first official assignment as a captain awaited her. At 37, she had already logged more than 15,000 flight hours, served in the Air Force, flown combat missions in Afghanistan, and received training that other pilots could only dream of. Today was supposed to be her day. As soon as Maya entered the crew area, she was greeted by the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee and the hushed hum of pilots and flight attendants discussing routes and upcoming flights. She was used to these rituals. Before each flight, the crew would meet, discuss the route, weather conditions, and the aircraft's occupancy. This was her world. But something was wrong. As soon as she entered the break room, the conversations suddenly died down. Several people cast appraising glances at her, and someone pretended to be immersed in their phone. She already knew that look. New was written in their eyes. But not just any new one. The first black female captain in the airline's history. "You must be Captain Brooks," came a voice from behind. Maya turned around and met the gaze of a man of about 50, with gray temples and the same gold captain's stripes on his uniform as hers. "Captain Richard Whitmore," he introduced himself, extending his hand. She shook it firmly. "Nice to meet you. Welcome to Skylink," he said with a barely perceptible, forced smile. "I'm your checking captain for the next few weeks." Maya noticed that his eyes remained cold despite the smile. "I've already familiarized myself with the route and the weather conditions," she said confidently. "Today we have a relatively calm flight, some turbulence over the mountains, but nothing unusual." He nodded but did not answer. "Briefing in room C, crew is already waiting. Meet me there." And he turned around and left. When Maya entered the briefing room, the crew was already assembled. 6 flight attendants, her first officer James Lee, a young pilot with 5 years of experience at Skylink. James stood up, smiling. "Captain Brooks, nice to meet you. I've heard a lot about you." "It's a pleasure to work with you, Officer Lee," she smiled back. She had barely taken her seat when Thomas Barrett, the director of operations, walked into the room. A tall, sharp-featured man dressed in an impeccably pressed suit, he was known in the company for his dislike of change. Everyone fell silent. "There are changes in plans," he announced without looking at Maya. "What changes?" James asked, glancing quickly at Maya. "Captain Whitmore will take command of Flight 207. A tense silence fell over the room. Maya felt her insides tighten. "Excuse me?" Her voice remained calm, but there was a steely edge to it. "I was appointed captain of this flight a month ago." Barrett glanced briefly at Whitmore, then looked back at her. "This is standard procedure for new captains. San Francisco is a complex airport, and management felt that a more experienced pilot should take command." Maya felt anger boiling in her chest. "Sir, I have flown to San Francisco 73 times in the last 10 years. I am familiar with every nuance of landing at this airport." Barrett didn't blink. "This is not up for discussion. You need to wait outside the door. We will reassign you." A subtle, barely noticeable chill ran down her spine. She looked into Barrett's eyes. "Understood. It was on purpose. Not because she's inexperienced. Not because that's the company's policy. Because they didn't want her here. Because she didn't fit into their picture of the world." She collected the documents, turned around and left the room. As soon as she closed the door behind her, the cold corridor seemed even emptier than before. She leaned against the wall, clenching her fists. Memories were spinning in my head. How her fellow Air Force soldiers used to bet on how many weeks she could last. How during the first flights, passengers asked to replace the pilot after learning that there was a woman at the controls. As her father, a former pilot, always said, "You have to be twice as good to get half as good." She waited 10 minutes until the storm in her head subsided. When the door opened again, it was James Lee. He looked awkward. "Captain, this is nonsense, and you know it." She looked up. "What did they say after I left?" He lowered his voice. "They said it was standard practice." "But, Maya, I've been here 3 years. I've seen other new captains come in. None of them had their internship this way." Maya gritted her teeth. She was set up. Where was I reassigned? On a flight to Seattle, with Captain Harold Wilson. She froze. Wilson. The man who spent years campaigning against hiring women and minorities at Skylink. She felt anger rise up to her throat. "Clear." James looked worried. "If you file a complaint, I will support you." She assessed the situation. Complaining won't change anything. She'll just get labeled as a difficult employee. She took a deep breath. "I'll figure it out." Maya did not take the plane into the air that day. But she knew. It was not the end, but only the beginning. The next morning Maya arrived at the airport earlier than usual. Yesterday left a bitter aftertaste, but she already knew how to deal with it. It wasn't the first time someone tried to make her leave, but each time she proved the opposite. Now she had to do the same. Her new flight was a short flight to Seattle. Easy route, no bad weather, no landing problems. It felt like a deliberate test. And even worse is Captain Harold Wilson. This man's name has long been circulated among pilots as a synonym for the old school, the one where women were supposed to remain flight attendants and only real men could be pilots. Maya already knew his reputation. Today she was supposed to fly with him in the cockpit. And I was ready for anything. When she entered the crew area, Captain Wilson was already sitting in the briefing room, hunched over flight paperwork. He didn't even look up at her. The first officer, Peter Lawson, glanced nervously in her direction and tried to smile. "Captain Brooks, good morning." "Good," she replied, sitting down opposite Wilson. "You're new, huh?" Wilson finally muttered, not looking up from his papers. "First day in the Skylink cabin." Maya nodded. "Well, let's see how you cope." His tone was dry and cold. "We do everything according to the standard, without improvisation," he continued. "There are no military here. No one will take risks because of your pilot's instincts." Maya felt anger rising inside her. "Standardization is the basis of security," she answered calmly. Wilson chuckled but said nothing. Maya knew this type of man. They believed that it was enough to ignore a woman for her not to exist. But she was here, and she cared. Wilson didn't say a word to her before landing. Peter Lawson glanced nervously between them, but did not intervene. The entire cabin was filled with silence. Maya watched Wilson work. He was methodical, precise, but too self-confident. She knew he wouldn't be caught making any serious mistakes, but she expected a show of power. And she was not mistaken. While landing in Seattle, Wilson suddenly misdiagnosed the communications frequency. Maya noticed it right away. The airport control center did not respond, and he continued to speak into the idle channel. She could have kept quiet. But that's not her style. "Captain, it seems Seattle is now at 28.35, not 124.75. Wilson froze. Maya saw his fingers tighten on the controls. He looked silently at the confirmation signal on the instrument panel. Took a short breath. "You're right." He quickly corrected the frequency and then continued flying as if nothing had happened. Peter breathed a sigh of relief. As the plane landed and taxied to the gate, Wilson finally looked at her. "Good eye, Captain?" "Most wouldn't notice." She nodded. "Thank you, Captain." But his next sentence said more than praise. "One good reaction doesn't make you part of Skylink." She understood. For him, it's not a question of skill. It's a question of belonging. And she didn't belong to him here. When they returned to Chicago, Maya was immediately reassigned to a new captain. Once again, a company veteran, a man known for his conservative views. The pattern repeated itself. She was given the worst routes, minimal rest hours, strict checks at every step. It was not an accident. It was a test. That evening, as she sat in her new apartment, her phone vibrated. A message from her sister, lawyer Zoe. "How was your first day? Have you fought off the old farts yet?" Maya smiled. She wondered whether she should tell him everything, but instead she answered briefly. "I'm just warming up." Now she knew. There are people in the company who don't want her here. But now she was here. And she had no intention of leaving. After a week of testing and endless checks, Maya finally felt like she had been given a break. Her new flight was standard, Chicago to Los Angeles, no difficult weather conditions, no stressful connections. But she knew that the break was just an illusion. She had been through too much to believe that she would just be left alone. A few hours before the flight, Maya headed to the maintenance hangar, where engineers performed routine maintenance on the planes before takeoff. She knew captains rarely came here, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. There she met Marcus Davis, a senior mechanic who had worked at Skylink Air for more than 20 years. "What brings you to our humble domain, Captain?" he grinned, removing his oily gloves. "I just wanted to make sure our bird was in good condition," Maya replied, smiling back. Marcus nodded. "Everything is fine, as always. Except that we are again forced to save on details." Maya tensed. "What do you mean?" Marcus glanced at her quickly, then lowered his voice. "You're new here, so maybe you don't know yet. Management has been pressuring us for a long time to speed up maintenance. Some checks should take several hours, but we're given an hour or less." Maya knew that airlines were always trying to optimize processes, but what he was saying sounded too alarming. "So you just signed the reports, even if the audit was not carried out in full?" Marcus looked at her, and then said quietly, "Do we have a choice?" She froze. This was the first warning sign. But not the last one. During the flight, everything went according to standard until the moment when one of the passengers pressed the button to call the flight attendant. Maya watched the situation on the monitor recording the cabin. The passenger in 14A looked worried, talking to a crew member. A minute later, the flight attendant contacted the cockpit. "Captain, a passenger is complaining about a strange noise coming from the wing." Maya tensed. "Describe the nature of the sound." "Dull thuds, as if something was loose." She glanced at her co-pilot, Jeff Carlisle, who was sitting next to her. "Do you think it might be a problem with the lining?" Carlisle looked uncertain. "It doesn't look like anything critical, but if the passenger noticed, then maybe something really is wrong." Maya wasn't going to take any chances. "Ask the flight attendants to check visually through the windows and contact the controller in Los Angeles. If necessary, we will request priority landing." She felt a bad feeling growing in her chest. When the plane landed, Maya immediately went to the technical staff. The engineers carefully examined the plane, and 10 minutes later, mechanic Joe Randall, a young specialist who had only worked at Skylink for a year, approached her. "Are you Captain Brooks?" "Yes." "What did you manage to find out?" He looked worried. The fastening of one of the panels was not fully secured. It could withstand a few more flights, but if the bolts had loosened more, the skin could have been damaged in the air. Maya felt a chill go through her insides. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. This is not the first case in recent months. We have reported this, but we are either ignored or forced to remain silent." She took a deep breath. This was no longer just someone's discontent. It was a criminal omission. Back in Chicago, Maya decided to talk to James Lee, her colleague who had already warned her about problems in the company. They met in a cafe near the airport. James, taking a cup of coffee, was the first to speak. "Did you want to know how far it went?" "Yes. I just flew on a plane that might have had problems with the skin. It was not an accident. James nodded. This is Skylink's policy. The faster the maintenance, the more flights can be performed. And if the mechanics start complaining, they will simply be replaced. Maya tensed. You speak as if you have known this for a long time. Because I know. James leaned closer. I've seen reports where mechanics are forced to sign off on inspections they didn't do. They can't refuse or they'll lose their jobs. Maya felt a mosaic coming together in her head. And the management covers all this? Barrett. The name of Thomas Barrett, Director of Operations, rang out like a gunshot. He controls the technical department. He also gives orders to speed up the service. Maya squeezed her fingers tighter around the cup. Now she knew what to do. She will start collecting evidence. And when the moment is right, it will strike so hard that no one will have time to react. Maya sat at her desk in her apartment, documents, notes, and photos she had been collecting for the past few weeks laid out in front of her. All of it pointed to one thing: Skylink Air was knowingly violating safety regulations to increase profits. She knew that if she simply filed a complaint, the company's management would hush it up. Barrett and Wilson were too powerful. They would find a way to destroy the evidence, and Maya herself would be labeled a problem employee who failed to adapt. But if she collects irrefutable facts and makes them public, then they will have no choice. She dialed her sister's number. Zoe, I need your help. Zoe Brooks worked as a lawyer for a human rights organization that specialized in exposing corporate crime. She knew how people like Barrett worked. They met in her office, where the walls were covered with cases she had handled, from major lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies to environmental investigations. Zoe looked through Maya's documents without saying a word. You realize that with this they won't just fire you. They'll try to destroy your career. Yes, but if I don't do anything, someone might die. Zoe sighed and ran her hand through her hair. Then you need more than just papers. What exactly? Recordings, videos, living witnesses? Maya nodded. I already know who to talk to. The first was Marcus Davis, chief mechanic. They met in a parking lot near the airport. He was clearly nervous. I can't lose my job, Maya. I have a family. Do you want the news to show a Skylink plane crashing one day, and you knew you could have prevented it? He ran his hand over his face. What do you want from me? I know that you are forced to sign reports even if no inspections were conducted. I need proof. Marcus hesitated, but then he took out his phone and sent her some files. Here. These are copies of orders from Barrett. He makes us close the faults without repairing them. Next was James Lee, her fellow pilot. I can help, but unofficially, he said when they met in a cafe. That will be enough. He gave her printouts of emails between Barrett and airline executives. It says here that minimal delays are more important than minor malfunctions. They call it process optimization. Maya clenched her fists. Now she had proof. There was one last step left. The next morning, she showed up at the Skylink Air office, this time not as a pilot, but as someone ready to break the system. She walked up to Barrett, who was standing in the hallway, discussing something with the managers. Captain Brooks, what's the matter? He asked, looking at her with a grin. She put a folder in front of him. This is evidence that you knowingly violated safety rules for the sake of profit. Barrett's smile disappeared. You are delirious. I sent copies to the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, and major news outlets. He turned pale. At that moment, Maya knew she had won. There was an oppressive silence in the Skylink Air office. Barrett stared at the papers in front of him, his face slowly losing color. He flipped through the pages, his eyes darting between reports and email printouts that featured his name far too often. Maya stood in front of him with her arms crossed. Did you really think that all this would go unnoticed? Barrett slowly looked up, his gaze darkening. You're making a huge mistake, Brooks. She chuckled. A mistake? In revealing the truth? In refusing to turn a blind eye to criminal negligence? Barrett leaned back in his chair, trying to regain his usual arrogance. You won't prove anything. You have no real evidence. Maya tilted her head to the side, as if thinking. What about the official orders your mechanics signed? Or the audio recordings of conversations about how to speed up aircraft maintenance at the expense of safety? Or the emails where you personally gave instructions to ignore minor malfunctions? Barrett gritted his teeth. You don't understand how business works. Maya shook her head slowly. No, Barrett, you don't understand how aviation works. Safety should always come first. But you decided that money is more important than human lives. She took a step forward, placing her palms on his desk. And now I will have to answer for this. Within 2 hours, the information had spread across all news portals. Scandal in Skylink Air, falsification of documents, and dangerous malfunctions. FAA investigation, company deliberately hidden airliner problems. The pilot who was not afraid to stand against corruption. Chaos broke out in the Skylink office. Barrett locked himself in his office, while groups of employees stood in the corridors discussing the news. The company's director, Paul Ferguson, urgently summoned the board of directors. When Maya entered the meeting room, all heads turned to look at her. Captain Brooks, do you have anything to say? Ferguson's voice was tense. Maya took documents out of the folder. I brought evidence, and the FAA has already started an investigation. These are not just my words, these are facts. Victoria Carter, one of the council members, shook her head in displeasure. Do you understand the damage this has caused to the company's reputation? Maya leaned closer. Do you understand that people could have died? Barrett and Wilson were fired that same day. The FAA has grounded dozens of Skylink flights and prosecutors have launched an investigation. The company found itself in crisis. But most importantly, the system that was built for so long for the sake of profit has finally collapsed. 2 weeks later, Maya was offered a promotion. She could have become head of security at another airline. But instead she chose another offer. She was appointed director of flight safety at Skylink Air. Now no one will be able to keep silent about the problems. And no one will ever put profits above people's lives again. When she first walked into her new office, her phone vibrated. Message from sister. I'm beyond words with pride. You changed the system. Maya smiled. Yes. And this is just the beginning.